In our modern age, England is not particularly well known for its vicious wildlife. In fact, about the most dangerous large animal you'll encounter here today would probably be a cow, considering that many of the country's deadly native species were wiped out long ago. However, if you were to take a trip back in time to the Mesozoic era when the dinosaurs stalked the ancient landscapes, the UK would have been a pretty terrifying place to be.
Over 120 million years ago, the rocks you see beside me here were laid down in a coastal floodplain environment. This environment was home to a whole host of predatory dinosaurs, including Spinosaurs, early Tyrannosaurs, and a vicious carnivore called Neovenator.
Neovenator was a member of the long-lived dynasty of meat-eating dinosaurs known as the Allosaurids, and would have been one of the apex predators of this early Cretaceous period ecosystem. Neovenator could have reached lengths of around 7 meters or 23 feet, and its name comes from the Latin for new hunter, as this was the first dinosaur of its kind to be found as a relatively complete skeleton in this part of England, putting a new perspective on the prehistoric ecosystem of the time and showing that a terrifying predator once roamed these lands.
Neovenator was discovered emerging from the cliffs of the Isle of Wight, an island off the south coast of England known as the UK's Dinosaur Island. Thanks to the particular geological formations exposed around the coastline here, it makes it an exceptional place to discover dinosaurs.
Neovenator was a fearsome creature, and a very exciting discovery when it was first unearthed. This carnivore was clearly a perfectly adapted killer, and was one of the largest predators in its ancient environment. In fact, it was such a formidable dinosaur that it was quite possibly one of the few that the Spinosaurs living in this prehistoric ecosystem would have had to fear. Fragmentary bones from Neovenator were first discovered in the summer of 1978 by a couple of holidaymakers who noticed some dark bone pieces that had washed out of the cliff. Over the next few weeks, a geology student also collected some more bone fragments on the foreshore. These bones were soon sent to the Isle of Wight Geology Museum, and then onto the London Natural History Museum, where paleontologists realised these bones represented some sort of herbivorous dinosaur as well as an unknown species of carnivore. During the 1980s, as more pieces of its skeleton weathered out of the cliff, more people collected parts of these two dinosaurs' remains, and the first proper scientific study of these animals began in the late 80s. A preliminary report was published in 1990, but it wasn't until 1996 that the mystery carnivore was officially given a scientific name, Neovenator salerii, the new hunter named after the Salero family, as the bones were discovered on their land. A couple of other very fragmentary skeletons belonging to different individuals had also been found further along the cliffs in the 1980s, which further added to our understanding of this dinosaur when it was first published. Additionally, more remains from the original skeleton were uncovered on the foreshore in later years, and there's a possibility that more may still be found as smaller pieces continue to wash out, although most of the skeleton has likely already been collected. So recently, I set off to the Isle of Wight to try my luck at finding any more pieces of this fascinating predator. Joining me is paleontologist Megan Jacobs, a PhD student at the University of Portsmouth who has lived on the Isle of Wight her whole life. Meg is an expert on the geology and rich fossil treasures that can be found on this incredible island, and runs a guided fossil walking company, White Coast Fossils. Through these guided walks, she helps people find their own fossils and learn more about the fascinating prehistory of this part of the country. Meg is also currently running a crowdfunding campaign in order to fund the publication of her new book on the geology and fossils of the Isle of Wight. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but do be sure to head to the link in the description if you're able to help out.
So Meg has brought us to the site where Neovenator was first discovered, and where people first got their glimpse at this marvellous predator. So Meg, what makes Neovenator such an important find among Isle of Wight dinosaurs?
So I believe it was the first big theropod that was found here, and it was basically one of the first almost complete skeletons of a theropod dinosaur here. There was only bits and pieces of small ones found before, so and it still is one of the most complete ones here on the island.
Neovenator was uncovered from rocks that are part of a geological formation known as the Wessex Formation, a subdivision within the larger Wealden group. The Wealden spans some 15 to 20 million years of Earth's history and records a dramatic transformation of an ancient Cretaceous environment. The start of these rock sequences preserves river and lake ecosystems that stretched across a prehistoric floodplain, But towards the end of the Wealden, the rocks were deposited in lagoons that then began to have more of a marine influence as the sea levels rose during this time, eventually flooding the landscape. Neovenator lived at a time when this long-vanished environment had a Mediterranean-like climate, and it was still a vast flat coastal plain, crisscrossed by great rivers that were prone to flooding. These surges of water, carrying suspended sediment and sometimes the bodies of dinosaurs, are what we have to thank for the marvellous fossils of prehistoric organisms we find today, as the remains of dead animals were washed onto the floodplain and occasionally ended up in stagnant shallow ponds of water, where they became buried by muds and eventually turned to stone. This particular location on the island's south coast, the final resting place of Neovenator, can tell us a lot about the kind of environment these dinosaurs would have been inhabiting, as locked within the sediments here are indicators of ancient climates.
So you can see behind us the very distinct changes in the colours of these sediments. What do those colour changes indicate?
So basically they're changes in the environment. So we start off down at the bottom with some like light blue layers. They're going to be essentially like little channels. And with standing bodies of water, so any minerals in there, the colour, all the minerals leach out and there's a standing body of water. Then the mottly colours is caused by sort of fluctuations of the water table or plant roots going down. And it's basically changes in the iron oxides, so different things rusting. And then as you go up, it gets more red, so that's red indicates a lot more drier soils. So the iron in those had a chance to rust completely. And then blues and dark grey clays, they're usually standing bodies of water. So you're basically going, as you go through the sequence, you're going wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry. And that you can see that in the colours.
Neovenator's bones were found entombed in one of the layers that represents a standing body of water, a type of sedimentary layer called a plant debris bed. In fact, many of the dinosaurs discovered on the Isle of Wight come from such layers of sediment. So what's so special about plant debris beds? Why do they preserve dinosaurs so well?
So plant debris beds through the Wessex Formation stand out because they're a blue clay with lots of burnt wood in. And we think they're the remains of ponds or billabongs or flooding events. Basically, each one is different in terms of how it's formed. But in essence, you've got a standing body of water, which would have been anoxic in the bottom. So there's no oxygen. So when things get washed in there, there's not any bacteria or anything to break them down. They're buried very quickly. And that leads to very good levels of preservation.
This remarkable level of preservation has allowed researchers to learn a lot about the anatomy of dinosaurs such as Neovenator, and in turn, to understand how they fit into the broader evolutionary tree of dinosaurs. When Neovenator was first analysed by scientists, they recognised that many of its features resembled the famous Allosaurus. In fact, for several years, researchers classified Neovenator as a close relative of Allosaurus, with one study even finding it to be a sister taxon, meaning it was the closest known relative to the dinosaur. However, the methods of analysing the relationship of this species to others changed in later studies, and Neovenator was positioned a little further away from Allosaurus, as a very early diverging member of the family Carcharodontosauridae, the so-called shark-toothed reptiles. This family is named for Carcharodontosaurus, a dinosaur known from northwestern Africa with teeth that were considered to resemble a great white shark's. Carcharodontosaurids are still included within the much larger Allosauroidea grouping, so under this classification scheme, Neovenator is still an Allosauroid, it's just not as close to Allosaurus. However, because this is vertebrate paleontology and nothing ever stays the same for long, other studies in the early 2010s changed Neovenator's classification once more. In this version, Neovenator had an entirely new family of Allosauroids named after it, Neovenatoridae, and it represented the earliest branching member of this family. But more than that, Neovenatoridae was actually found to include the Megaraptors, a fascinating lineage of big-armed predatory dinosaurs that for a long time had very uncertain relationships to other theropods. So going by this classification scheme, the Neovenatorids actually survived right up until the end of the Cretaceous period, close to the famous mass extinction event as the Megaraptors, and they became pretty diverse, since quite a few Megaraptor species are now known, and they range in body size significantly. But you'll never guess what happened next. Things changed once more. As I've detailed in my video on the Megaraptors, these dinosaurs are now actually considered to be members of Tyrannosauroidea, the the superfamily that also includes T-Rex. Neovenator is still considered to be an allosauriod though, but the family Neovenatoridae probably only includes Neovenator itself, as far as we can currently tell. So if we accept that the Megaraptors are Tyrannosauroids and not Allosauroids, this means that, based on our current understanding, the allosaurs actually never made it to the very end of the Cretaceous period. They appear to have gone extinct sometime during the late Cretaceous, approximately 90 million years ago, but before the very end of the period. However, throughout their time on Earth during the Jurassic and earlier parts of the Cretaceous, they nevertheless gave rise to a diverse array of truly awe-inspiring predators.
So, long before the Tyrannosaurs became the top predators of the terrestrial ecosystems in the later Cretaceous period, it was the Allosauroids, such as Neovenator, that were the apex hunters of their time.
The Wessex Formation is a fantastic example of how the roles of the classic dinosaur predators changed over the course of the Cretaceous period. In addition to Neovenator, a smaller-bodied early Tyrannosauroid is also known from this place, a species called Eotyrannus, the Dawn Tyrant. This lightly built ancient relative of the infamous T-Rex is also known from a fairly complete skeleton, though not quite as complete as Neovenators. Sharing this ecosystem with the larger-bodied Allosauroid, Eotyrannus could not have achieved apex predator status at this point in time, and it would be many millions of years until the Tyrannosauroids became the dominant land predators of the Mesozoic. Still, its existence in the Wessex hints at the way of things to come, and provides paleontologists with a fascinating glimpse at the early evolution of the iconic group.
So the area at the time would have been a huge river floodplain. So this river, we think, started off in the Bristol Channel somewhere, came across southern England, around the island and down into France. Just the other side of Paris was the sea, so that's where it drained into. The main river would have been about 1 to 2 kilometres across. And what we see here on the island is sort of all the little tributaries going into the main river, the overbank floodplain with lots of forests, swampy, marshy areas. So overall, when Neovenator was living, it had lots of forests. It would have been very hot and very wet. So probably not somewhere you'd want to go today.
This hot, wet floodplain environment supported a diverse ecosystem of long-lost species. Neovenator was but one element of a complex web of life, and the remains of ancient organisms found on the island over many years of fossil collecting have helped to build up a detailed picture of just what sorts of animals called this place home.
On the island, we've got a very diverse fauna. So I think there's about 26 different dinosaurs. So it'd been living with big iguanodons, the smaller species like Brystonius, it was discovered with little Hypsilophodon, which are about 1 metre or so long. And then everything that was living in the streams as well and the ponds. So lots of crocodiles, fish, mammals. We've got lots of insects preserved here as well. So it was a really diverse fauna.
But of course, Neovenator was not the only big theropod dinosaur living in the Wessex paleoenvironment. The fossilized remains of Spinosaurs have been uncovered from this coastline too.
For many years, teeth from large reptiles clearly well suited for preying on fish and other aquatic creatures have been found in the rocks of the Wessex Formation. After Baryonyx walkeri was discovered in 1983 in a quarry on mainland England, and the study of this dinosaur revealed that it was a Spinosaur, many of the isolated teeth found on the Isle of Wight were realised by researchers to look very similar to the dentition of this species. As such, for several decades it had been thought that the Wessex Formation was home to Baryonyx as well, especially since the formation Baryonyx was discovered in, the Weald Clay Formation, dates to around the same time as when the Wessex was laid down. But then, in 2021, paleontologists announced that the Spinosaurs of the Wessex Formation were not what we thought. 2 skeletons belonging to these dinosaurs had been gradually weathering out of the cliffside over several years, not far from where Neovenator was discovered. Based on the features of these newly revealed bones, scientists realized that they were not Baryonyx, but actually 2 new species of Spinosaurs. One was named Ceratosuchops and the other Riparovenator. Both are represented by fragments of skulls, and Riparovenator also includes a partial tail. The presence of at least 2 species of Spinosaurs alongside the other large-bodied carnivorous dinosaurs of the Wessex Formation has some very interesting implications for the ecology of this long-lost environment. In addition to Ceratosuchops, Riparovenator, and Neovenator, There was of course also the smaller medium-sized Eotyrannus, plus another large meat-eating theropod only known from some partial remains, which has not yet been given a name. It therefore seems that the Wessex was home to a rather high diversity of predatory theropods, but clearly it was able to support the existence of all these animals. It's also not a particularly uncommon thing for formations to yield so many different theropods. We see similar trends with coexisting tyrannosaurs in Canada, multiple carcharodontosaurs in South America, and several big-bodied theropods in the Morrison Formation in the western US, just to name a few examples. Still, for all these dinosaurs to live in the same ecosystem, they must have had ways of avoiding competition with one another.
These Spinosaurs were adapted to feed on different food sources than those of Neovenator. While they would probably still have taken terrestrial prey given a chance, their anatomy indicates a tendency to consume aquatic creatures.
The long, croc-like snouts and fairly conical teeth, perfect for gripping slippery fish, are clear signs that Ceratosuchops and Riparovenator were well adapted for a specialised aquatic diet. In contrast, Neovenator wields serrated blade-like teeth suited for tearing flesh, presumably from the hides of the large terrestrial herbivores that lived in the Wessex, such as the iguanodonts and long-necked sauropods that have been found here. So, going after very different animals would have been one way that the theropods avoided conflict with one another and could share the ecosystem. That's not to say that there would never have been conflict between the Spinosaurs and Neovenator, however. Although the Wessex Spinosaurs were large animals themselves, and have been estimated as being longer than the only completely known Neovenator skeleton, there is some unconfirmed evidence that Neovenator could have grown to larger dimensions. As such, it's not out of the question that a particularly big-bodied Neovenator could have posed a serious threat to the Spinosaurs, if it chose to pursue them as targets, perhaps during times of particular seasonal stress when other prey options were scarce. So Neovenator could quite conceivably have been a dinosaur that Spinosaurs feared, a testament to its nature as a formidable prehistoric predator. The smaller Eotyrannus, meanwhile, would presumably have been going after terrestrial prey as well, but was likely more of a mid-level predator, taking smaller dinosaurs and other animals compared to Neovenator. The other unnamed big theropod in the Wessex, though, was potentially fairly sizable, with estimates putting it at around 5.3 meters in length. Not a great deal is known about its ecology, however, since it's only known from very partial remains. But again, it's a reflection of other formations from around the world, where there were also multiple big theropods coexisting, and with such a great diversity of other animals in the Wessex, there was clearly enough prey for everyone. I must also add that the Wessex Formation does record a significant span of time, and includes several million years of Earth's history. So it's not entirely certain that all of these species lived at the exact same times as each other, though the close proximity of the fossils to one another does suggest there was most likely an overlap. Neovenator has intrigued scientists for another reason too. When looking at the fossilized bones of its upper jaw, bones called the maxilla and the premaxilla, researchers noticed an interesting texture.
These bones have many little pits and grooves on their surface, which paleontologists thought might indicate that Neovenator was very touch sensitive on its face.
They wondered if all the openings might once have been part of a complex nerve system that transported sensory information from the jaws and teeth to the brain. Consequently, researchers CT scanned the jawbones to examine how the holes connected internally, and indeed found that they were linked by a branching network of channels within the bones. Interestingly, such systems of intricate canals in the snout of extinct animals had, before the discovery of Neovenator, typically been associated with aquatically inclined species. Examples include the pliosaurs, fully marine aquatic reptiles, as well as the Spinosaurs. It had been thought that these internal systems and the openings might be related to Spinosaurs having highly sensitive snouts for detecting the movement of prey underwater, perhaps analogous to the pressure sensors found in crocodilians. However, the discovery that Neovenator has a similar system, yet appears to be a very typical theropod without any indication of aquatic specialization, could cast doubt on the true function of the openings in Spinosaurs. It's still possible that they were indeed used to detect underwater prey, but clearly terrestrial theropods also had functions for these systems. The scientists made a couple of suggestions about what theropods such as Neovenator would have used the complex neurovasculature for. The openings and vessels in the bone would have meant that Neovenator had a rather sensitive snout and face, Perhaps this therefore played a role in interactions with other members of their own species. We know that tyrannosaurs engaged in facial biting, inflicting each other's jaws and skulls with non-lethal bites, and they also have pretty complex neurovascular systems in their jaws. So perhaps there was a precedent for such aggressive intraspecific interactions in many different theropod lineages. Another idea is that the sensitive snouts could have been useful for detecting temperature changes, helping the dinosaurs find and maintain a suitable environment in which to lay their eggs and incubate them, similar to modern crocs and some birds. This just goes to show that, as terrifying as it probably would be to come face to face with a dinosaur such as Neovenator, they were not monsters. These were fascinating real animals with complex lives and behaviours, and they would have had to reproduce and make sure that their eggs had the best chances of hatching. The complex channels in their facial bones could also have had a function related to the way in which Neovenator hunted and fed. It's generally thought that this dinosaur had a hunting style similar to that of Allosaurus. Studies of the neck and jaw muscle placements in Allosaurus have shown that it was capable of striking its head downwards onto prey items very quickly, and would then retract its head backwards to pull at flesh, much like a modern bird of prey. This is in contrast to the way that tyrannosaurs and modern crocodilians tear meat off their prey, with violent side-to-side thrashing movements of their heads. You may also have heard of the hypothesis that Allosaurus used its upper jaw like a hatchet. This idea suggests that the dinosaur could have used its powerful neck musculature, wide gape, and very strongly constructed skull bones to bring its upper teeth down and into the flesh of its prey like a person wielding a hatchet. However, this idea has been critiqued by various other researchers since it was suggested, and so it's unlikely that Neovenator fed like this either. But we can see that Neovenator was pretty well suited to a mode of feeding that involved stripping the flesh off of the bones of its chosen prey, while mostly avoiding biting into the bones themselves. Going back to those openings on the facial bones and the complex system of nerves they would have housed, another potential use for having a particularly sensitive snout could be in feeling the difference between meat and bone while eating. Paleontologists suggested that Neovenator and other Allosauroids might have been very picky about how they ate their meals, unlike the later tyrannosaurs that freely crunched through bone. Looking at patterns of wear on the teeth of Neovenator, this again supports the idea that they were only slicing into softer material and tried not to bite bone, since they display similar patterns to the teeth of modern carnivores that avoid bone contact as much as they can, such as cheetahs. So, despite its fearsome appearance, Neovenator might have been very delicate when it came to handling its prey. Still, if it came down to it, I reckon a bite from a tyrannosaur such as the bone-chomping T-Rex would probably have been a better way to go than what Neovenator and relatives were doing. A single bite from T-Rex in the right place, and that's an immediate game over. But Neovenator, with its slicing teeth and its preference for softer parts, would be shearing big chunks off of its prey, so in theory, it could have taken quite a few nasty fleshy bites to take down a large herbivore. Not a great way to go.
We do also have some potential evidence for the types of animals that Neovenator was feeding on, since a plant-eating iguanodontian dinosaur was found associated with a meat-eater at this site, and some of those iguanodontian bones had bite marks on them.
So when Neovenator were discovered, it was all the bones were mixed amongst an iguanodon skeleton as well. And we find that on the island quite often when we find a theropod here, we find a herbivore as well. Maybe it was a predator trap. But these bones were labelled as iguanodon for a very long time, until a few years ago, there was a guy called Jeremy who came along and re-examined the bones, and they re-described as Bristonius simmonsii after Keith Simmons, who found them. And it's slightly different to all the other iguanodons because it's got a big nose. So it has like a bump on its nose rather than being like a horse-like head. But it was sort of medium-sized, like any other iguanodon, but with a bump on its nose.
One of the Bristonius bones, a backbone, shows a vicious-looking series of 3 gouges, clear indications that this animal's spine had been bitten into, with the teeth piercing deep through the flesh and raking across the bone itself. While the Bristonius bite marks are not definitive proof of Neovenator specifically feeding on this animal, it's also not impossible that this is what they show. They could have been inflicted by a crocodilian or some other kind of theropod living in this ancient environment, but the close association of the Neovenator and Bristonius skeletons makes it tempting to think this was an instance of a large predator chomping into the back of a plant eater. Although Neovenator apparently had a very sensitive face that helped them mostly avoid contact with the bones, they could have accidentally bitten into them every now and then, and perhaps that's what we see on poor old Bristonius' spine. The skeleton of Neovenator itself also reveals other signs of the violent lives these dinosaurs likely led. Similar to the well-documented injuries seen in the famous big owl specimen of Allosaurus, the Neovenator bones are also littered with damage that this animal sustained during life. These include bony growths on the ribs, vertebrae and limbs, as well as evidence of infected bone on the toes, among various other injuries. Clearly, whatever Neovenator was doing when it was alive, it experienced some pretty violent interactions with other animals or its environment. It's conceivable that these injuries were the result of conflict with struggling, desperate prey, or perhaps even evidence of aggressive behaviour towards other theropods.
Neovenator is an incredible animal and must have been a formidable predator. I'm certainly quite glad there's nothing around in England today that's quite as deadly as this, but what a fantastic creature it must have been to see in the flesh.
Although I didn't have much luck finding more Neovenator on the day I visited, seeing the site where this magnificent dinosaur was uncovered deepened my appreciation for the importance of the Isle of Wight's fossil heritage. The fossils found here have provided us with so much insight into this world that once was, and it's not only dinosaurs that can be found on the island. Much younger creatures, those that lived after the dinosaurs went extinct, can also be discovered on the beaches to the north, including turtles, alligators, and prehistoric mammals from around 30 million years ago, as well as very recent creatures that once inhabited the region, such as mammoths, bison, and hippos, which lived here only a few tens of thousands of years ago.
So the island, we have a lot of geology here. So down the middle of the island is a fault. So all of the south side of the island is basically being pushed up. So we've got all of the Cretaceous rocks exposed from 130 million through to about 80 million, 70, 80 million. And then when you go to the north side of the island, it's a lot younger, about 50 to 30 million. So by literally walking along the coastline, you're going through 100 million years worth of geology. And most of the rocks here are very fossiliferous. And we have fossils here that are not found anywhere else. So we're very lucky that all the rocks have been uplifted. Otherwise we wouldn't have dinosaurs here, we wouldn't have the geology, it'd just all be flat and we wouldn't find any fossils.
So if you're ever in southern England, I'd highly recommend giving fossil hunting on the Isle of Wight a go. And if you want a guided fossil walk that will take you to the best places and help you understand what to look for, then Meg's company, White Coast Fossils, offers just that.
Well, thank you, Meg, for taking us to this site and telling us a little bit about the geology of this locality. As I mentioned earlier in the video, you've written a book. What's this book about?
So the book is called A Field Guide to the Geology and Fossils of the Isle of Wight. So it's essentially for the general reader, and it's got every bit of geology in it and a huge, fully comprehensive fossil identification guide. So you can go down the beach, understand the rocks, and also identify any fossils you find, and actually some stuff that aren't fossils but look like fossils as well. So
wow, well, it sounds brilliant. We'll give a few more details, but if you go to the description of the video, there will be a link to the crowdfunding campaign to make this book a reality. So please do go and help out if you can.
A Field Guide to the Fossils and Geology of the Isle of Wight is a truly exciting book and will be incredibly valuable to anyone interested in prehistoric life. This accessible guide features more than 330 full-colour photographs and diagrams showing what kinds of fossils and rocks you can expect to find on the UK's Dinosaur Island. It also includes a history of paleontological science on the island and an explanation of its geological structure, highlighting why this place is so special. If you ever want to identify a fossil you found on the Isle of Wight, or if you're thinking of planning a trip here to try your hand at fossil hunting, this will be the book for you. Again, the link to the crowdfunding page is in the description below, so please do contribute if you can. I really hope you enjoyed learning about this wonderful dinosaur. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to my other channel, 7 Days of Science. Over on this channel, my co-presenters and I make weekly videos covering all the most fascinating science news of the past week. So if you'd like a good way to keep up to date with the latest discoveries, you might like what we do over there. We also have a Patreon page where you can support us in return for some fun bonus content, and we've just started up an email, 7dos.stories@gmail.com, where we encourage researchers to contact us if they'd like us to feature their work, or if anyone in the audience would like to provide us with feedback on how we can improve the show. Please do like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and be sure to press that bell icon so you don't miss our next upload, and so you can learn more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all.